Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host Martin, and I'm very happy to have you with me today to have a great conversation to bring to you out there in listener land with Andres Gomez Emilsson. We spoke a few days ago, and it was just a really delightful, very enjoyable conversation. I think you guys are really going to be quite interested in everything that Andres has to share. He has his degrees in computer science, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science, and we kind of do a breakdown of a whole bunch of different psychedelic experiences, talking about salvia divinorum, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, MDMA, and I forget what else we talked about, but we talked about a lot, and it was a really enjoyable conversation, so I'm excited to bring that to you today. But of course, first, we do have a few announcements to get to before we get to the conversation. So let's get those going. Thanks to Ika for making yet again another contribution in support of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. Thank you so much, Ika. Really appreciate your continued and ongoing support that you've been displaying over the past few weeks. It's been great. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to Brooke, who makes a small monthly contribution every month via PayPal. And let me also thank my ongoing patrons over at my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/MartinWBall. If you would like to join up as a member of Patreon, you can go to my main webpage of www.martinball.net, and there's a link for PayPal and also for my Patreon page up at the top right of my main webpage over there. So it's a great way to support this podcast, and also if you join up at Patreon, you do get gifts with my art sent to you once every 3 months, depending on the level that you're at. You can also get access to a monthly 30-minute check-in and consult or a monthly 60-minute check-in and consult with me. And of course, I am always available for 30, 60, and 90-minute consultations to help you integrate your psychedelic and non-dual experiences. My webpage for that is non-dualentheogenicintegration.com if you want to find out more. Looking at what is coming up on the podcast, going to be having a conversation very soon with Rob Bateman from Adeptus Psychonautica. I think we're mostly going to be talking about DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, and also just spending some time to get to know Rob better and his work over at Adeptus Psychonautica. I think that's going to be a lot of fun to have that conversation. Also going to have a continuing conversation with Nix, who was on the show a few months ago, and also speaking with one of her clients and also roommate, Helgi, over there in Iceland, and we're going to be talking about facilitating 5-MeO and also working with 5-MeO in conjunction with MDMA and DMT and talking about their experiences. So that'll be a lot of fun to bring to you as well. And actually, I did have another thank you that I wanted to make. I wanted to thank Magda, who over this past week organized a private online 5-MeO-DMT educational event with me as the subject or presenter, and had a great conversation with about 10 people. We talked for almost 3 hours, and just thank you so much, Magda, for organizing that and putting that together and bringing me on to talk to your circle of people that you work with in Canada with 5-MeO. It was a great delight and pleasure, and it was great to meet all of you. And looking forward to talking to some of you more, because I know you're booking some private sessions with me to talk about your experiences. So that was great. Thank you so much, Magda. Really appreciate it. Also, before we get into our conversation with Andres, I just want to tell you a little bit about the music track that I'm putting at the end of this week's episode. So the other week, my family and I were traveling out in Maui to visit family, and there were just so many humpback whales at Maui while we were there. And you could hear, if you dive underwater, you could hear them singing. So anyway, I got the great idea that I would take my GoPro and strap it to my ankle and float out into the deeper water and just let the camera run and see what kind of audio it might capture. And I was just ecstatic with the number of whale calls that it recorded. So I was able to extract the audio from the GoPro video footage, and I made a song out of it. And so that's what's going to be gracing the very end of this episode. It's kind of a long song. It's a little over 10 minutes, about 10 and a half minutes. and it's got the whale songs all the way through, and I composed I think, a great song around all of it, kind of trying to go for that sort of whale sort of essence. And it's available at my Bandcamp page if you want to check it out and download for free the full quality audio version. That's martinball.bandcamp.com. But I'll be sharing it with you here at the very end of my conversation with Andres, and it's just simply called Whale Song. So I hope you enjoy it. As soon as we got back from Maui, I extracted that audio and started constructing that song, and really had a lot of fun doing that. And it's my first new audio track of 2022, so cool. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into this conversation with Andres. So here you go. Enjoy. I'll just share with kind of the circuitous route of how this interview came about, which I thought was kind of funny. So it was like a month or maybe a little bit more ago, maybe 2 months ago now, someone on Facebook, I've got lots of friends on Facebook. Most of them I don't actually know who they are, because people send friend requests and you're like, oh, this person looks cool, accept. So anyway, this person that I don't think I'd ever heard from this person before, sent me a message on Facebook Messenger with a screenshot from some message board conversation that was taking place or had taken place somewhere on the internet. And in it was your name, and someone had commented, you should have a conversation with Martin Ball. And then you wrote, oh, sure, Martin, if you see this, I'd love to. And then this person also sent a link to a relatively short video of yours about, I think it was called A Rational Approach to 5-MeO-DMT.
Sure. Yeah.
So I watched the video, and then I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. I'm going to contact this guy, Andres, and let's see if he wants to come on. And so that's how it all came about. And then I searched you on Facebook, like, oh, damn, we're already friends. I didn't know that. So I apologize. I didn't know anything about you beforehand.
No.
So I've watched the video, and I thought it was really interesting. So I have a number of points that I'd like to cover with you today, if we could. And first place that I always like to start is just to get to know you and get a little bit of your background, a little bit of your education. Then I think we're going to need probably a little period to talk about the vocabulary and language that you use. Mm-hmm. And then we can get into the analysis and we can talk all about it. Okay? How does that sound?
Perfect. Yeah, so I guess to start off, I would say I was born with the luck or unluck, I guess, of having the personality trait of being extremely obsessed about the nature of reality, very confused about it. Just I would describe myself as hyper-philosophical, meaning that I can't actually hold a normal job because I'm just thinking about reality and confused about consciousness all the time. So, well, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but no, so from an early age, basically I was just like, okay, what is this thing? Can we understand it? And for a long while, basically, I thought that physics and math was kind of like the way forward. Obviously, I still think that's essential key component of like any holistic picture of reality. Oh yeah, and I guess I went kind of pretty deep into that. Like I was like a math Olympiad kid. Like I was gonna be a mathematician. Like figure out why there's something rather than nothing, like through physics and things like that. But then I guess when I was 16, I tried marijuana, which actually like I had a very, I think, like idiosyncratic reaction to it. So. Like it's something that like only happened once, and like any other time, teenagers and so on, like it was kind of like a normal type of effect. But there was one time where like I had a really unusual effect on THC, which is essentially like a kind of like full ego dissolution experience. And like back then, like I was already very philosophical. I used to think a lot about, for example, the teleportation, thought experiments, like. What is the source of personal identity? Is there really kind of like an identity carrier over time? But what happens if you split? What happens if they make a perfect copy of you? I used to think a lot about that already, but I was puzzled by that. I had like no conceptual framework with which I could actually address that type of question. But I knew that, there's probably something to it. And then, on that one occasion, basically kind of dissolved into a ocean of orange consciousness. And I got kind of this feeling of oh my gosh, like, yes, I am kind of this vessel that is full of kind of this orange kind of like consciousness inside of it. And then kind of realize like, well, I can see it as if I'm the vessel, but I can also think of it as like I am the orange consciousness inside. And then realize the orange consciousness was also outside of me, outside of the vessel. And it was also what was like animating or what was making real my friend who was there as well. And kind of there was this radical shift of like, well, I can actually see it as like I'm a vessel or I am the ocean of consciousness. And so what's going on here? Now, I should say that, in the moment, it felt kind of like huge epiphany, kind of like very revolutionary for my mind. I didn't know about Eastern philosophy at the time or religion or anything like that. In the next morning, I realized, okay, that was an experience. It was like really profound, but I cannot just take it at face value. So actually what kind of ended up happening was, now I've got to, okay, like research like philosophy of mind and also consciousness, because this all of a sudden opens up as the bigger mystery. So I was already interested in consciousness, but since that day, actually, I made it kind of like my life mission to understand consciousness, and also to kind of like open up the possibility of, hey, like maybe this oneness thing actually might be kind of revolutionary in some sense. So kind of the approach I had to that experience, I could say, was it was like, okay, it was an interesting, fascinating experience, but can we prove this, in a rigorous kind of philosophical, scientific way? Can we like actually convince somebody who's stone cold sober that we're all one consciousness? And I would say like maybe for about like 4 or 5 years, I really made it kind of my life, the thrust of my life, kind of this like whole oneness thing. Like I used to think like, yeah, I'm just gonna write the book that's gonna convince everybody we're all one, and this is gonna solve everything. Like all wars will be ended and things like that.
Sure.
And yeah. So go ahead.
Let me ask you about the experience itself. So at the time, so you're in Mexico. Is that where you grew up?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're 16 years old. You're getting high on marijuana, and are your friends just like, oh yeah, there goes Andres, like getting all deep and philosophical, or were they like, dude, you're just high, or like, what was the reaction at the time?
Well, I was with a very close friend of mine, and he was also very high, and I think like he doesn't remember very much. I think he kept telling me like, dude, write it down because I'm not gonna remember what you're telling me. It didn't happen. I do remember, almost all of it, but I wish I had, recorded the moment or something. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm always interested that, and actually, it's gone now. But when we got on Skype, you had the opportunity to write like a little quote, and I think your quote was, "The thought of oneness and the experience of the thought are already two things," or something like that. And so, kind of going back to this first oneness event that you had, were you so absorbed in it that you could not talk about it and were just kind of in awe of the epiphany, or were you narrating your way through it as it was happening? And this is always kind of an interesting question, especially we're going to be talking about 5-MeO DMT, and that's one where sometimes people narrate their way all the way through, and then other times it's only something that they can articulate after the ego starts to reassemble, or might even be months after before they can really say. So I'm kind of curious what the time frame was for you with this experience and when you were able to really express about it.
I remember trying to explain as much as I could at the time. I remember I kept like repeating the phrase universal consciousness. It's all universal consciousness. I remember just that phrase. But I also remember kind of this feeling of detachment, this feeling of like wow, like there's this character talking, but that's not exactly what I am. And it almost kind of like the thing the character was doing was kind of like funny. It didn't feel like it was exactly me doing it. There was kind of some detachment there. But also it was like full of, I think like surprise, wonder, and almost a lot of like comedy qualia as well. Like it felt like very funny. Like, oh my gosh, I've been missing out on this understanding all my life. Like, yeah, but I bet that I probably didn't make that much sense. I suspect I probably was like speaking in like relatively short phrases, and like I was not, stringing together like a coherent narrative or anything of the sort. That definitely came later.
Okay. And your friend's like, dude, you're kind of overwhelming me. Just dial it down a bit.
No, my friends are very, I mean, they're like, very, very close friends from childhood. And like I knew him for like already like 8 years or something. Like and we, like, that's one of the things I'm also pretty fortunate that, um, like, I would say that like, I like, um, the gap between like the headspace in which where I was like when I was a kid, let's say like 10 years old, and like the vast majority of people and like my teachers and so on was like just unsurmountable, just like the degree of interest in philosophy and like questioning reality and so on. So to some extent I felt alone, but then I did find a couple friends, two in particular, that were like actually peers, and like to this day I think like they're, yeah, brilliant people, and like they are very open and like really into philosophy as well. So um they were, yeah, I think that one friend was actually like really accepting. I think he was very much thinking like, yeah, you're probably undergoing something really profound, I just have no way of making sense of what you're saying. So
Yeah. Yeah. And just out of curiosity, were you inside, outside?
I think it was in the bathroom of like the house of my friend, where like his parents were gone for the weekend or something like that.
And and they're trying to go to the bathroom, and all of a sudden this epiphany is like, oh my God, this is it.
Exactly.
It's funny where these things happen, you know. I mean, sometimes people make a big deal about the context, and then other times it's like, look, this kind of stuff can happen anywhere, anytime. It doesn't really matter. It's more when you're ready for it, and you might be going to the bathroom, or you might not. You might be in sacred ceremony, but it doesn't really matter, because it's you anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So that was the first insight and sort of set off.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I guess I should to continue contextualizing a little
yeah.
bit, like
Yeah.
um, there's definitely been like additional kind of important kind of like conceptual reframes of the whole thing. I would say so, like from 16 to maybe like 21. That was kind of like my main thrust was like, okay, oneness. But then I read a bunch of David Pearce, who's like this philosopher. Do you know about David Pearce by any chance?
Yeah,
Like,
I'm familiar with the name, but can't recall. I don't think I've
yeah,
ever actually read him.
okay. He's a, yeah, British transhumanist philosopher who advocates for the elimination of suffering throughout the living world. And yeah, basically, I'm a big fan of his work, and got to actually know him, invited him when I guess I should also mention like one of the reasons why like after that experience I actually became really determined to like perform really well in school, go to kind of like a prestigious university. All of that was not because of like, okay, I want to, furbish my ego with that. It actually was more like, I've got to gather some like bare minimum of credibility so that my message can go further.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so okay, like I was lucky, even though I was an international student, I got into like Stanford, and then I co-founded the organization called the Stanford Transhumanist Association, which, by the way, like if any of you is kind of a college student or so on, I highly recommend like founding your own like college club, for the simple reasons that it's essentially a force multiplier. Because especially if you're at a prestigious university, because then you can actually invite like great thinkers and speakers to your college and like record it, put it online. Like essentially that gives you an outlet for actually kind of meeting really interesting people. So thanks to that, essentially, I invited David Pearce to Stanford. I managed to talk with him, and yeah, I mean, essentially the kind of a transformation that happened was this realization that even if we all understood we were all one consciousness, chronic pain would still be a problem, and like fits of anger might still be a problem, and I mean depression, anxiety, like there's a lot of things that are probably best understood from a pragmatic, physiological, biochemical point of view. And I think of like oneness as kind of like more the motivating principle of like, oh gosh, yeah, others are like suffering, there's factory farmed animals, all of that. It's like, yes, it's you. So like, let's actually kind of urgently realize this needs to be solved. But let's also be like ruthlessly pragmatic about like how to solve it, because ultimately, yeah, it may come down to something, yeah, kind of silly, like, identifying a new drug that actually gets rid of suffering. Anyway, there's much more to say on that domain, but just to kind of contextualize my headspace.
Yeah, well, I think that that's an important point because with the emphasis on the experience of oneness, I do think it's powerful. I do think it's transformative, and it's an experience that I would like to invite everybody in the world to have if they have the opportunity to go into that. That I do think that it's something, especially as human beings, I kind of look at it as a fundamental human right, that I think it's our right to experience that. But I've also always said it in no way is ever going to solve all your problems.
Yeah.
It just isn't, and it's not going to solve all the problems of the world, but it can provide a perspective shift so that at least we stop the polarization that happens within society, and that also the disconnect between humans and nature, humans and animals, and helps us understand that whatever we are is actually all of this. So how we attend to all of this is relevant for how we are treating ourselves. So I do think it's a powerful element of making the world a better place, but it's not the quote unquote solution. Like, also, I mean, you just mentioned chronic pain. Like, back in July, I got this pain at the top of my spine, and it won't go away. And I've been to physical therapy, and I've been to acupuncture, and I've been to the doctor, and I've been for massage, and no amount of oneness is going to make the pain go away, right? It's still there. I can still understand, yeah, we're all one and I am the pain, but it still fucking hurts.
Yeah.
I mean, like, at the practical level. So oneness doesn't solve our problems, but it does free us up in certain ways, I think.
100%. So to add a little bit further information. So like the third phase, let's say, after the David Pierce phase, then together with Mike Johnson, who's he studied math and philosophy of science, and he's like a brilliant philosopher, and he wrote this book called Principia Qualia, where basically a lot of it is like wonderful insights, which was kind of like very synergistic with like the philosophy that I had been developing. But essentially, since then we co-founded what's now the Qualia Research Institute, and basically one of the main focus of this organization is like understanding valence, and valence is basically the pleasure-pain axis. And essentially we have models for like actually what is this, like what makes an experience feel good or bad, and like that will connect with oneness, will connect with equanimity, will connect with pain. Like I'm very happy to kind of like delve into any aspect of it, but suffice it to say that the sort of like therapeutics that I think like will actually kind of revolutionize like our ability to, for example, deal with chronic pain, will probably look like understanding what is the actual fundamental, structural properties of pleasure and pain, and essentially finding ways of targeting particular what we call like dissonant structures in the nervous system, and essentially like any kind of discomfort we associated with, in our theory, with a particular kind of dissonance. And essentially, we're working on how do you cancel out dissonance in a principled way, in a way that doesn't make the problem worse. Anyway, I'm just putting a bunch of little pins, and happy to double click on any of them.
Yeah, but let me ask you. So in going to Stanford, were you a philosophy student at Stanford?
No. So the only colleges I applied to were those that had a cognitive science degree.
Okay.
Stanford had something similar, which is a symbolic systems. It's called symbolic systems, and in practice is this kind of the same curriculum as a cognitive science degree, which I mean roughly is kind of interdisciplinary, and it mixes especially philosophy of mind, psychology, and computer science. So like I mean, I was, as a teenager, it's like, okay, I'm just going to study math, but then kind of like, okay, like, I'm going to use maybe my math skills and mindset to this other domain. So computer science for me, obviously, it's super important. If you're in college, again, as a recommendation, take computer science courses. Like, don't waste the opportunity to do so. I would highly, highly recommend it. Because, in the end, philosophy is something you can learn on your own at the end of the day. But I obviously took a bunch of philosophy of mind courses, and kind of delved a lot into it. And I guess ultimately, I actually disagree with the vast majority of philosophy of mind and the courses that I took, even though I consider them an important foundation to get to where we are, essentially.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's important to study what you disagree with to understand why you disagree with it, and it helps you develop your own argument for why you disagree with it and be able to articulate that. So it's just interesting with this cognitive science, and then also the transhumanism and computer science. And so this is kind of a sidebar question, but you also work in the psychedelic space, and
Yes.
this is something that I've seen. Honestly, I don't scroll Facebook much these days because I just find a lot of it just really toxic. But I do see people who identify as being in the quote unquote psychedelic community speaking out against transhumanism and against
Sure.
artificial intelligence and,
Yeah.
just the evils of computers and technology and just the idea that, that they want to steal our souls or whatever. And I personally, I have a very favorable view of science and technology. And, I even wrote my novel, The Soul and Darien Game, is all about unitary consciousness.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got it. You've got my book. Oh, damn.
I'm gonna say I haven't read it. I have read another one is called Being Human, maybe, but
Yeah.
I haven't yet read into this one, but I've got it.
Oh, well, that's cool. I'm excited that you have that. I'd be interested to hear what you think, especially because I don't come from a transhumanist background or a cognitive science. For me, it was more a philosophical approach to it, and also just a practical approach from my own experience. But I'm just curious, with that transhumanism foundation, have you experienced pushback against that, or people criticizing you for like, oh, you love computers, what's wrong with you?
Oh my goodness. Well, there's layers to this, but let me say the following. So I used to be a huge proponent, like teenage years. I mean, like this used to be how I used to think, essentially. Like if you were to interview me when I was like 12, like seriously, I would say, if you don't think that a digital computer can be conscious, you're insane, because like digital computers are like just made of the same matter as you and I, and consciousness is just the result of information processing. So if you program the appropriate information processing algorithms, you will get conscious experiences as a side effect. Essentially, that whole strain of thinking, I will say, like by and large, is the way in which pretty like smart people think, very like systematizers, people who are like kind of like into math and computer science, and I've got to say, like it's actually like very compelling. Like it makes a lot of sense, and I will 100% say that people who are kind of like all into kind of like nature and energies and animism, they cannot actually pass what's called an ideological Turing test, which is like when you ask somebody to explain like to you like what you believe, right? What arguments you use. So I will say that there's kind of this gradient where like, typically people who are really into nature, into like psychedelics and reconnecting and so on, they have no idea what the arguments for example, like AI becoming conscious are. Like there's a disconnect. Like now, however, after a lot of philosophy and like so many additional insights, I am convinced that digital computers cannot be conscious. So it's kind of like I am what we in our circles we call meta-contrarian, which is like if saying that computers could be conscious is to be kind of a contrarian to common sense, I'm like way past that. I'm like, okay, like no, even that actually is an incorrect view for very sophisticated reasons that are like non-trivial. And interestingly enough, I get much more flack, not from people who are into like nature and psychedelics, but actually from like the sort of community I used to be like very, very embedded in, which is kind of rationalist community, people who are basically working on AI safety and so on. They think I'm crazy for thinking that digital computers cannot be conscious. So that's why there's kind of like layers to these. But I would say I mean I very much think that there are like important intuitions that the people you're pointing to have, and a lot of it is like based on first person experience. And those intuitions, I think there are components of them that are like very valid. There are also components of it where like people are kind of like taking at face value their experiences without like questioning deeper like why they feel the way they feel. just as an example, there is this concept we called the tyranny of the intentional object, which is that the way in which our minds are constructed is such that we essentially believe and experience the source of pleasure and pain as coming from semantic content. So, for example, you may, if you get a car, you kind of like feel like, yeah, the source of my happiness is having this car right now. It's kind of this like state of the external world is determining my inner happiness or unhappiness. Mm-hmm. But if you actually meditate and pay attention to actually what is going on there, well, there is the semantic content which then triggers states of well-being. And then the states of well-being actually have nothing to do with the semantic content. There's actually a disconnect. The state of well-being has much more to do with an inner sense of harmony and peace and free flow of energy and unblocked energy flow. It's something that has nothing to do with owning a car, right? Like that's kind of a, but for the most part, we are kind of our mind trick us into believing that. Yeah. So let's say you're having an intense psychedelic experience, you're communicating with the spirit of the tree, and you're feeling this sense of peace and beauty and so on. I would say there's actually two things going on here. Like there is the feeling of communicating with this tree, but then there's also the valence component of your experience, and they're separate things. And the thing is, like, most people don't realize that, and they will kind of interpret it as, yes, the source of peace and goodness and so on was the connection with the tree itself, which, yeah, I don't think that's the case. So there's kind of like a lot of mind tricks that you have to disentangle to kind of, see the picture correctly.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, because sometimes I like to refer to even 5-MeO DMT. I say, really, it's just a magic trick, that it's not the source of the experience and what you actually get from it. It's the trigger, right? Which allows the magic trick then to take place, but sure. It's how you are internally processing your experience. Now, here's where I think I could use some education from you. So I was a philosophy student going 90 to 94. That was back when I was a philosophy student, and eventually I did graduate school religious studies, because I wanted to study Eastern philosophy, but it's never taught in philosophy departments. You have to go into religious studies department if you want to study like Buddhist or Taoist philosophy. So that's where I ended up going. And as a philosophy student back in 90 to 94, I was mostly into moral and political philosophy, because, I was one of these, social activists, like, I want to know what's right and how we do it and, be on the right side of history. So you use a language like with valence, qualia, these kinds of terminologies that I myself am not intimately familiar with. I'm only, passingly familiar with, and I don't know about my audience if they're familiar with these terms. And you said, I think you created the Qualia Club, or I'm not sure if that was the right term.
Qualia Research Institute. Yeah.
The Qualia Research Institute. So maybe unpack a few of these terms for us. But before you do, my dog Moxie wants to go out and bark at some deer, so I'm just going to let her out to go be a dog and do her dog thing, and I'll be right back. Yeah, so awesome. So things like qualia, valence, yep. and if you could tell us a little bit about which is this the cognitive science? Is this a computer science? Is this philosophy of mind? Or is this multidisciplinary in terms of this terminology?
Yeah, totally. So I would say it's primarily philosophy of mind and some psychology terms. So first of all, qualia. I mean, I love the term qualia because it refers to something so fundamental and intimate that I think like maybe 90% of people have like had the thought of like, what is that? They have no idea that there's a term for it. And they have no idea of how to even formulate the question or formulate the way of like even talking about it. So maybe when you were a kid, you wondered, is the blue that I see the same blue that other people see, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a key question. A lot of people have that question, right? A lot of kids realize that. In most people's mind, it's kind of like, okay, there's no way of solving that. I'm just gonna, put that in in the depths of my subconscious and not think about it. But I kept thinking about it. It's like, is there any way we could potentially ever find out, like, is the blue that I see the same blue that you see? So qualia would be kind of this raw, sensate quality of the blueness of blue that you experience. And it is very important to realize that actually, for example, the qualia of colors, in this case, is not actually frequencies of light. That's a very, very, very common mistake that people make. They think, yes, blue is kind of like the way in which your brain renders, I think, like 400 nanometer like wavelengths and things like that. That's just absolutely not the case. Why? Because you can have synesthesia. You could actually be blind and have synesthesia, where like with sounds you experience color qualia, you experience shades of blue and pink and magenta and so on. That's one reason. Another reason is, do I have it here? I think I have it here. Um, yeah, essentially, like also the actual shape of the space of possible colors is not a spectrum, is not a line, is actually a circle. This is the symbol of our organization, where essentially it reconnects. Like there's actually a color that is called a non-spectral color, which is magenta, which you will not see it in the rainbow. It's not in the rainbow. What you need to experience magenta is essentially simultaneously add blue and red. And that's why it's called a non-spectral color. So essentially what we call the state space of color qualia does not correspond to the state space of possible inputs, meaning that you can study qualia independently of the senses. Qualia has a geometric structure that is somewhat isomorphic to the structure of senses, but not quite, and therefore is actually, logically distinct from it. And essentially, qualia also applies to, for example, the way in which sound feels like, the way in which tactile sensations feel like. What is that, right? And at an even like stranger level that people may not realize, actually thoughts have a way in which they feel. It's something that also, for some people, like it takes, for example, getting high to realize, like, wow, like my texture of thought is slightly different. And therefore, I'm able to think in a slightly different way. What's going on here? Like, it's kind of like we're, the typical metaphor of like we are fish in the water. We don't realize that there's water around us until, you modify the water or you take us out. But essentially, qualia will correspond to the raw sensate level of every facet of your experience. And that's what we study. So like one of the objectives that I have long term is mapping the state space of all possible qualia. It's like, okay, there are colors, there's, tactile sensations. What is the structure of that? But there's also, like the DMT feelings that one gets. And there's probably like, 100 different, DMT, different shades of qualia that are like DMT specific, that like you don't experience in normal life, you don't experience on even LSD and things like that. There's ketamine qualia, there's salvia qualia. There's a huge range of qualia that is outside of the normal kind of like range of human experience. And all of it is part of reality. Like all of it, just by the mere fact that they exist as possible experiences, means that they are somehow embedded into the fundamental structure of reality. So essentially, I anticipate that like if we actually map out the range of all possible qualia values and varieties, it will in some sense be isomorphic to, kind of like the fundamental structure of reality. Like what is reality fundamentally made of? Okay, maybe I'll stop there before I go further.
So let me just throw a couple different things at you and see what you make of them. So using somewhat of a different language that, like you mentioned my book, Being Human, and there I kind of introduced this idea that different psychedelics, they all are infinite in their own way, but they have their own infinity spectrums. And I said they each have their own quality of presentation, so that each one has its own particular feel to it. So I'm kind of using, I think, the language of qualia because I'm talking about the qualities of the experience, but I'm not using that same philosophical language. So I just wanted to see if you felt that that's kind of in line, or am I off base there? And then since you mentioned magenta, I absolutely have to throw this one at you because this never happened before and it had never happened since. And this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, and I was tripping. I mean, I was way in deep on I think it was MDA and 4-ACO DMT. And I mean, I was really, really, really deep in, and I had my eyes closed, and I don't remember what was going on with my eyes closed, but there was a lot. And at one point then I opened my eyes and I was in my living room and everything was magenta. And it was like I was in some kind of discotheque, and like these magenta light would come this way and then this way, but everything was magenta, and I was just like, wow,
Yeah.
it's magenta, and I've never seen a dominant color like
Yep.
that, and it was so impressive. I was just, wow, this is fantastic, and it felt fantastic
Yeah.
as well. I was just
Yeah.
I was just awed and amazed, like, it's so magenta, like
Yes.
this is so pretty. Oh my god, I love this.
Yeah.
So I just have to give that to you because it
Yeah.
was such a unique experience, and I've never seen anything even remotely like that or
Yep.
experienced anything remotely like that either before or since then.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. But I've got to say, it's you can have that with any color. Actually, you can even have it with colors that are not within normal human experience, including this exotic color that is blue yellow and also red green. But um, essentially, what you're describing, it's called a color casino. So essentially, it's where all of your visual field gets kind of super concentrated on a particular color, and it actually requires like a threshold amount of coherence and concentration for your state of consciousness. So you can actually induce these in a somewhat reliable way if you're like a meditator and you go on a what's called a casino retreat. So what you do is you stare at a candle like for a minute until it forms an after image in your retina. Then you close your eyes and then you meditate on the after image. And you do this over and over and over, like, 10 hours a day for like a week. And by about like or 2 weeks, for about like the fourth day or something like that, you will start experiencing these sort of things in a really reliable way. Like yes, everything is now this like super intense pink, or like now everything is super intense blue. And also this is fascinating because when you get to kind of like those levels of like intense concentration on a particular color, it is intrinsically blissful. And actually, we think, there's a reason why it's intrinsically blissful. I will get to it eventually, which is the symmetry theory of valence, that essentially those states of consciousness are hyper concentrated, and therefore they lack dissonance. So they're actually like highly energized, low dissonant configurations of consciousness, and therefore like very pleasant. And there's, I guess, like another thing I could mention about this is you can replicate this a little bit in the lab with a setup with a VR and eye tracking. So essentially, what you do is you can put a let's say a yellow yellow circle in a blue background or something like that, or any two colors really, and essentially you reposition the yellow circle to where your eye is moving. And usually you cannot do it without eye tracking because essentially you're constantly moving your eye with saccadic movements anyway. Mm-hmm. So like. And that's kind of essential to refresh the image, essentially. But if you do this, there's a very weird thing that will happen, which is that either the boundary, the boundary will kind of like start to dissolve, and either the color that is inside the circle will start to kind of like propagate across the visual field, kind of like watercolor, and then it's all going to be that color, or the other way around, the color from the periphery will kind of wane out and will propagate inside, and it's just going to be the color of the background. So all of this actually connects very deeply with how we currently understand like how a lot of like visual processing algorithms work, which is a balance of forces. So essentially the way in which your visual field is being painted, like from moment to moment, it's every color is actually trying to propagate as much as possible, kind of like in a watercolor way, but is being prevented from doing so from the other colors that surround it. So in some sense, actually, the boundaries are illusory. The boundaries are like where these forces are meeting. And, when you have like, okay, a psychedelic experience like the one you're describing, it's essentially what happened is like one of these colors won and then is reinforcing itself. So like, and when you get to like, okay, a color that is the one and reinforce itself, it acquires a life of its own. And it becomes like this like stable, robust, strong experience of magenta or whatever color it may be.
Okay. All right. So this is so much fun. So I'd like to throw a couple other things at you. Getting into psychedelic states and psychedelic visuals. So something that here three things that I find that are very interesting about psychedelic visuals. One is that you can have one thing going on behind closed eyes and then open your eyes and it's something different entirely taking place. And other times you can see the same thing behind closed eyes and then open your eyes and the same thing is going on. Then there also are times where to see psychedelic visuals, you can look around and you can look at them and like, oh, wow, look, and it's happening over there and it's happening over there. And so you can kind of look at it as a normal 3D object. And then there are other times where, well, at least I'm just speaking for myself, where I notice if I fix my sight and don't move, which is unlike as you say, in normal everyday perception, our eyes do have to move in order to refresh the image. If we stare too long at something, yes, it fades into, just a blur. But here, if you stare really intently and you don't move, then the structure comes out. And then through your peripheral vision, you can actually see the structure of the whole thing. But as soon as you move your eyes, then the whole thing disappears.
Yeah.
So I've noticed these very different visual qualities that show up at different times in psychedelic experiences. So in terms of qualia and mind algorithms, what would you have to say about that?
Totally, 100%. We have explanations for everything. Okay, here's the challenge. Throw anything at me. I'll have an explanation for it. Okay, now that's
awesome.
My ego speaking, but yeah. No, I think obsessively about these things. And okay, so to address the first one, why is like closed eye visuals and open eyes visuals different? Okay, so there is this really remarkable difference that happens in brainwaves between like eyes open and eyes closed. And I will probably get this wrong, but it's one way or the other. But essentially, eyes open versus eyes closed like modulate alpha waves. So essentially, by merely opening your eyes, I think it's like you're massively increasing the amplitude of alpha waves. Essentially, one way in which you can think of brain waves, the way we think about it at QRI, they're essentially kind of the backbone of your experience. They're kind of like creating this mesh that have a particular quality. We describe it in terms of like dissonance, consonance, and noise. And essentially your brainwaves are giving rise to the evolutionary selection pressures for the patterns that can survive in that environment. So essentially your brain is kind of like creating this micro ecosystem, and it has a weather. Let's say it has a weather. And then some patterns are much more likely to survive and reproduce and replicate and make coalitions and so on in some weathers relative to in other weathers. You can also see this with a mood. I mean, essentially, in our theory, very pleasant moods are very consonant. So as a consequence, they give rise to very symmetrical and smooth patterns of thought and feeling. Mm-hmm. Whereas like very diswrought, unpleasant moods are essentially jagged and dissonant. And so the type of thoughts and feelings that get selected are those that is surviving in that environment, which usually will be like spiky and and aggressive and misshaped. Mm-hmm. So essentially, the difference between having eyes closed and eyes open is, there's this massive difference in like the alpha amplitude. And so the evolutionary selection pressures for the psychedelic patterns that you're experiencing are very different. So it's not only that you're going to switch between channels, you're also going to switch between quality of visuals. And right. I would like broadly characterize that essentially with eyes closed, you will have like somewhat more holistic patterns, essentially patterns that encompass the entire of your visual field. They don't get stuck in kind of the minutiae of whatever you're looking at. And so it's much easier to essentially achieve kind of these like blissful, harmonious states of consciousness with eyes closed, because the waves of energy can actually travel through your entire visual field without disruption. Okay, so that's that part. Then the other thing you're asking is, okay, this phenomena of like staring at a particular region of the visual field, and if I understood what you're referring to, you're talking about essentially this symmetrification of patterns, that like you're starting to kind of like see that pattern propagate throughout your visual field. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. So that happens to some extent when you're sober as well. Like a lot of people can like stare at a patch of grass, and then like what will happen is that, deeply what's going on, this is a phenomenon of resonance. So essentially, there will be patches in the grass that essentially are kind of like representative of a lot of other patches. And so they will kind of like form these like nodal points of like, oh yeah, this kind of encapsulates a lot of the structure of all of those patterns. and they will start to resonate with the other components of it. And essentially, when you have two things that are resonating, when they interlock, they contain the same information. So when you have one region of your visual field here and another one, and they actually interlock in resonance, they become perfectly symmetrical. Now, one fascinating kind of like result here from like talking to a mathematician, I wrote this out in an article in 2016. He essentially experimented a lot with this phenomenon, and what he did was like it is reported in forums and so on that like, okay, your vision becomes very symmetrical in psychedelics. But then the question is, what kind of symmetries are possible there? And it turns out that, from a mathematical point of view, there's actually 17 possible ways of tessellating a plane. They're called the wallpaper symmetry groups. And what this mathematician did was, take LSD or 2CB, then go into sensory deprivation and like let those patterns symmetrify. Mm-hmm. And then like examine what kind of pattern it is and take note. Is like, oh, this is a star 632 symmetry. This is a 444 symmetry. And eventually he filled out the table. So essentially that shows that every possible mathematical symmetry is something that your visual field can render in those states. I guess like the last thing I'll mention is that broadly speaking, when you have this symmetrification going, is roughly analogous to kind of having the a soap bubble become perfectly symmetrical. So essentially what is going on is that this physical system that is your visual field is trying to lower its energy. I mean, we're always doing that. Every physical system is trying to minimize its energy. And essentially states of symmetry and resonance are energy minima. So essentially when you interlock into kind of this resonant structure, the reason why that wins out in kind of that environment is because there's a lot of extra energy coming from the psychedelic, and that energy is trying to go somewhere. And the symmetrical configurations are locally the low energy configurations of kind of the high energy range of states of consciousness. So, okay, I just threw a bunch of stuff, but
wow. Well, it's all just so fascinating. But going back to, if you could just address this last one of, why is it from your explanatory field, why is it that sometimes you can lock on and then the symmetry in the structure opens up, and as long as you stay focused on it, it's there. Yeah. But then if you look around, then it disappears. Yet at other times, there might be, and I'm not talking about surface hallucinations, like looking at, look at the art, look at the wall, look at there's patterns, but like actually, multi-dimensional structures in apparently empty space. Yes. That sometimes I find I can look around and I can look, okay, well, there's the ceiling and there's the floor and here's the architecture of the walls, and you can see the whole thing, and it's not disrupted by eye movement or head movement. Yet at other times, it has to be. You can only see it if you're completely focused, and then it opens up from there. But if you move your eyeballs, it disappears.
Yeah. I mean, like I'll give you like a short answer and then maybe delve a little bit deeper into it. But yeah, the short answer is like, is the new information, like, is the structure that you generated anti-fragile enough to survive the onslaught of new information coming from your senses? And essentially, there's kind of a hierarchy of how anti-fragile these like hallucinatory structures are. There's like some very flimsy kind of like, you'd be to be just exactly in the right mindset to experience that structure. There's other ones that are like straight up just attractors that are like, there's like a whole bunch of states that take you to that particular structure. And my strong guess here would be that, if it's something that is like surviving, looking around and so on, is probably you're hitting on a strong attractor. If it's something that like doesn't survive that, it was probably one of these local minima of energy, but you could disturb it and it would go away. And in general, I would predict that the strong attractors will essentially have like a lot of like properties, which is that they will have symmetry on multiple dimensions. Mm-hmm. Essentially, multiple symmetries are reinforcing each other. I could go like deeper into that. I don't know if you want, but yeah.
Well, I invite you to. I mean,
sure.
Okay, this is a fascinating conversation, and I guess let me just add another dimension here. So one of my own personal theories is that the outside world, the apparent outside world, is working according to basic fractal geometric structures, And that one of the reasons, like, for example, we can see a tree is because it's a fractal structure. It has a certain geometry to it. And that our consciousness is also structured geometrically and fractally. And so that we can have, like, this question of how do we see the outside world? Is it all just a projection? And that my personal theory is that, well, actually it's a mapping, and that we can have relatively correct mapping, that we have the fractal tree structure in our consciousness, and we can map that onto a tree out on the real world, and then we have a relatively accurate perception of what that is. And then, of course, we could look at the tree and it's like, oh shit, it's turning into a monster, it's an octopus. And this is where the fractal structures of consciousness are now overtaking the sensory input,
Yes.
and then projecting and imposing and upon that. But it sounds like it fits within this world, this model of consciousness that you're speaking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. How to tackle this? No, it's a wonderful question. A couple points. So first of all, my working hypothesis, and again, like, I'm open in general to like revolutions in conceptual schemes and so on, but the hypothesis that I use to analyze these things is indirect realism. So I tend to essentially analyze these experiences as they're happening inside your brain. But there's, to some extent, some resonance interlocking between your brain and the outside world through the senses. Okay, so that's kind of an important point. So when you experience a tree in kind of this like crazy fractal way, I think that in a sense what's happening is that you're instantiating a resonant fractal structure inside your nervous system. Now, is that perceiving the tree more or less accurately? It actually will depend a lot on the specifics of the tree. So one of the kind of like overarching claims that we have at QRI, and also, based on quite a bit of anecdotes, is that, most of the things that we see, most of our normal everyday perception is approximately finely tuned for the level of fractality and patterns outside of us. Mm-hmm. So, in the African savanna and so on, like the degree to which we experience fractals in our experience more or less corresponds to the degree to which there's fractals in nature. Okay. But there's adversarial examples. So I'm very convinced that with a little bit more research in this area, we can legitimately construct some, like, let's say, digital fractals that a sober person would look at it and would say, like, oh, that's just a jumbled of images. I don't see any structure in it. And somebody on a psychedelic would have the right level of kind of what's called impedance matching, or essentially the propensity for achieving resonance between components of their world simulation, that they will actually be able to detect in what way this structure is a fractal. And it might be true. So there's kind of like a region of like adversarial examples that normal people will not be able to perceive properly, but somebody on psychedelics will. Mm-hmm. However, I think on most cases, in most situations in nature and in like everyday life, the psychedelic perception will be more distorted than the normal perception, simply because normal perception has already been like very finely tuned for like the kind of patterns that do exist in nature. So, and I think like this is the case. Like if you like inspect this, for example, in a substantial dose of something like 4-ACO DMT or something of that nature, like looking at a tree and like kind of like it will symmetrify, and as you see this fractal structure, is like, okay, like let me pay attention to this corner over here. Like it looks like it's shaped in this way. And then like you examine it carefully, it's like, no, actually it was shaped in this way. Like I was projecting that kind of like extra, fractality to it that it did not actually have. So in that sense, yes, there is absolutely this threshold where like, the fractality is like taking over. And it is kind of like an internal phenomena. I'll also mention like 100% the structure of our nervous system, I think, is fractal. It's not perfectly self-similar, but it is approximately self-similar and approximately scale invariant. And the psychedelic fractals are exactly the same phenomenon as the symmetrification of the visual field. So like you could have a symmetrification that is flat, is like, okay, this is just a tessellation, is like, one of those mosques, Islamic mosques and so on. That's one phenomenon. But there's also where the resonance happens not between structures of the same scale, but between structures of a different scale. So like, and through projective transformations. So like this hand and this hand in the classical example would be like, okay, this is mirror image. They can resonate this way. But if they're like here, they could also resonate this way because the brain can do this transformation, can do like okay, translation and projection and like putting it further behind. And those two things can also resonate. It's just that, yeah, they require this projective mapping. And when you have this projective mapping, essentially the lowest energy way of continuing it is like iterating it over. So essentially, yeah, fractals very naturally emerge out of two things. A, that the brain is a fractal structure. And two, you reduce the difficulty for resonance. Essentially, you increase what's called in electrical engineering the impedance matching between the components of your brain.
Okay. Wow. This is so much fun.
Excellent.
Yeah. And it's just interesting to reflect on, the sort of the different layers of these that I have seen. You mentioned tessellations, and then there's the arabesques, and there's sort of flat surface symmetries. Yeah. Like I did a lot of experiences mixing MDA and MDMA with 4-ACO DMT and 5-MeO MIPT, and sometimes throw in some MXC. I was doing all these cocktails and found these really fascinating tessellating structures that would first appear as like a blank sheet, and then like one triangle would flip over, and then suddenly they go all across the flat surface, and it would be 3D in structure. But then there is also, then suddenly you get this depth of field where then you have tessellating fractal structures that are now multidimensional, yeah, and crossing through different planes. And then also going back to the qualia, the sense of actually feeling all of this at the same time as seeing these things. And then like talking about trees, it just reminds me of a mushroom trip from years and years and years and years and years ago. I mean, I'm talking like maybe 25 or more years ago. I was up in Eugene, Oregon with a friend, and we were tripping really hard on mushrooms. And at one point he looked out the window and he's like, "Oh, there's a rainbow." And I looked outside and I was like, "Yeah, there's rainbows everywhere." And I was like, "But you know what? I can't tell if there actually is a rainbow there or not because I'm seeing so much rainbow." And then also looking at the trees, then they're all rainbow as well. So it can be very hard to distinguish what am I actually imposing upon what I'm receiving input from the visual field versus what is the contribution of my own mind and my own perception into that event. And in when you're really deep in it, I mean, you just can't say. I mean, you could even go for close inspection, but you get up all the way up to the tree and then you start seeing tendrils coming out. It's like, well, I don't think they're actually physically there, but I'm seeing them because I am superimposing and sort of growing the fractal structure that's already there, and I'm just adding to it. But you can't distinguish in the moment.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. This is fantastic. So, yeah. I mean, I'll apply similar principles again. I mean, essentially, okay. I'm thinking like what is probably the lay a bit of groundwork. So there's this concept also we developed called the algorithmic reduction, which is, okay, like on psychedelics, there's this zoo of effects. And like you can look at Psychonaut Wiki and like there's, 70 different crazy, like scenery slicing and tracers and like there's so many different kinds of things. Our claim is that all of that is kind of the leaves of really a branching structure that actually at the top, upstream, are like relatively simple effects that then when they're interacting with one another, you get all this emergent complexity. And so in some sense, psychedelics, I mean, obviously, if you take mushrooms and you see like this fractal Ganesh or whatever, obviously that was not in the mushrooms, right? Like that's something that your mind is generating downstream of the actual action of the mushrooms. Mm-hmm. So then the question is like, what is the actual action? What is like the fundamental effect that these substances are having on the nervous system that downstream generates all of this complexity? I mean, essentially we have kind of like stories or I would say like educated guesses of like what each of these substances do. So to begin with, like the family of like DMT and 4-ACO DMT and things in that vein, essentially they're like energizers. Like what they do is, it seems to me what they do is they have like two primary effects, which is that they activate some high frequency metronomes. So essentially these like high frequency buzzing vibration that energizes your visual field and your sense of self.
Yeah.
And also they increase the impedance matching, meaning they reduce the difficulty for different structures to resonate with one another. So like that's very simple effects, right? Like, but then when you think of those effects in light of how the nervous system works, again, the nervous system is constantly trying to minimize energy. So it's like being energized in this massive way, and resonance is becoming easier between different components of your experience. The way in which it will be minimizing energy is by essentially finding symmetries between them, because those are like local energy minima. So, and what you're saying of like, yeah, the fractal structure and so on, not only you see it, you also feel it. Okay, 100%. I'm like 100% validating your experience, because it's true, and we call that phenomena cross-modal coherence, that essentially the ease of coupling between different sensory modalities becomes higher, so it's easier for modalities to couple with each other. Now, as I was explaining, each modality recruits different kinds of qualia, and each kind of qualia has its own associated symmetry groups. In the case of color is the standard Euclidean 3D space. The sense of tactile sensations is a very different geometric space. But essentially, when you kind of make the different sense modalities couple with one another, it's kind of this Venn diagram of like, okay, what are the symmetries that this sense modality can support? What are the symmetries that this other sense modality can support? And if they're coupling, they're going to be inhabiting the symmetries that they both can support at once. So there's, in some sense, almost kind of like a narrowing of possibilities, but also a multiplication of possibilities, because by coupling these, essentially you're increasing what we call the dimensionality of the space. Essentially, the more degrees of freedom you're coupling together in this resonance structure, you're implicitly, in a functional way, generating a structure that inhabits a higher dimensional space. And the way I often describe this, let me see if hopefully this whiteboard will work. Okay, yeah. So this is just kind of like a rough example. So to give you an idea, so imagine you have like 3 planes, and this could be, let's say, a metaphor for like, okay, your visual input, auditory input, and tactile input. Metaphor is not exactly, but right. You have 3 planes, and you have like 1 dot in each of those planes. There are a total of 6 degrees of freedom here. Why? Because, well, this point has 2 degrees of freedom, this one has 2 degrees of freedom, and this one has 2. So if you want to specify this configuration, you need like 6 numbers, like 1 for each dimension for degree of freedom. But now, what if you interlock these dots in the following way, where essentially they kind of like become the phases of a cube, and the dots actually are kind of the projections of a dot in 3D space. Well, if you do this, something funny happens, because A, you're actually reducing degrees of freedom. You actually only have 3 degrees of freedom here, because like the dots are like interlocked, like you can't move one without moving at least another one. But usually if you move one, you're going to move the other ones because they're kind of like stuck together.
Right.
So you're reducing degrees of freedom, like you go from 6 degrees of freedom to 3, but you gained 1 virtual dimension. So like now by interlocking these dots in this way, you're simulating the behavior of something that lives in 3 dimensions. And likewise, when you're like interlocking your visual field and your tactile field, in some sense, you're reducing the degrees of freedoms that you have, but you're instantiating a higher dimensional object as a consequence, which is exactly why psychedelics are hyperdimensional. And like, it's true, there are higher dimensions of experience through this crazy interlocking process.
Okay, wow. So I want to get to 5-MeO,
Yeah.
but let's go to salvia, because you mentioned it, and this is one of my personal loves and favorites. And, you know, we were talking about the different qualities and the different structures and vibration. And when you mentioned like with DMT, 4-ACO, DMT and things like that, yeah, I perceive that as very high, very fine, very high vibration.
Yes.
Versus I've always looked at salvia divinorum as kind of being on the opposite end of the spectrum, that salvia is like, whoa, it's a really slow wave. Right? It's not super fine vibration. It's low and slow. And visually, it also tends towards like these conveyor belts of things going in and out at the same time. Then also things zipping and unzipping and turning inside out. And it's all slow. It's not fast, right? It has this more sort of this taffy-like space to it.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of, I used to spend the summers in Santa Cruz in California, and there at the beach boardwalk in Santa Cruz, they had this taffy making machine that you could walk by and see, and it has these arms going like this and like stretching out the taffy, and it's really slow and everything's stretching out. And for me, that was like, okay, salvia is like that.
Yeah.
So how would you talk about that in terms of the vocabulary that you're using here?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, the standard neuroscientific story for salvia is that it's disrupting the claustrum, and the claustrum essentially is this very key component of your brain that is coupling your sense of self with information about your environment. So yeah, on salvia, I mean, these crazy things happen. Both your sense of self and your sense of the environment dramatically become disturbed, and also the coupling between them become dramatically disturbed. Now, I don't think that's like a full explanation at all, because as you described, like, yeah, there's also these like weird like frequency changes and like conveyor belt things and yeah, unzipping, all of that. Absolutely, they happen on salvia. So the way in which I interpret it is that you are essentially, you get these like two uncoupled metronomes, like, okay, like your sense of self maybe in the parietal cortex and like where you are, your temporal lobe, like something of that nature. And they're trying to communicate, but they're failing to. So essentially, they're kind of like vibrating at different frequencies. And sometimes they interlock, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they interlock, sometimes they don't. And so they generate kind of these like this toggling effect between interlocking and not interlocking, interlocking and not interlocking, which I think like, yeah, generates this repeating structure, conveyor belt type patterns and unzipping. And so in that sense, like all of that is kind of like downstream of these like unfortunate kind of like, well, fortunate or unfortunate, but yeah, segmentation of your of your brain architecture.
Yeah, and any cognitive science explanation for why it is that like some people like myself, the first time I had a full salvia experience, I was like, this is fantastic. This is really amazing. It's totally different than anything else, and it's really, really fascinating. Yet for many people, maybe it's this toggling and this coupling and uncoupling and this distortion of sense and of self and environment that I'd say like 80 to 90% of people say, I don't ever want to do that again.
Yeah. Okay. Two reasons. So first of all, I mean, at the receptor level, I may be getting this wrong. I think it's true. Essentially, like salvia is very atypical because it's a kappa opioid agonist.
Yeah.
Okay. And that, at least in animal models, is been associated with social cognition, and in particular, kind of social anxiety and fear. So, roughly speaking, I think like a lot of the textures, maybe more so on like low dose salvia, but essentially, and this is definitely my experience and that of my friends, is like this feeling of intense social awkwardness. Like there's this feeling of like entering into an auditorium completely naked type of sensation, and you know, you can write it. Like if you know it's gonna happen, it's like, okay, I'm gonna experience a ton of social awkwardness. It's hallucinatory, no problem. My friends still like me. I'm not naked. Like, okay, you can probably, you know, that's fine. But then the more, you know, bizarre stuff that happens at higher doses, unzipping and so on. Okay, like to explain that and like why you found it fascinating and most people don't. We actually would require something like the frameworks from Qualia Research Institute, because essentially we think of the brain as a musical instrument that essentially has its various like resonant modes, and whether an experience feels good or bad is ultimately dependent on whether the combination of resonant modes are consonant or dissonant. So what happens with salvia, you know, okay, you disrupt the claustrum, the, you know, resonant dynamics of your brain get modified really radically. So your brain becomes kind of like a completely different, you know, musical instrument. So, you know, maybe you used to have like a flute in your normal everyday life. On salvia, you become a saxophone, or you become one of those like weird Chinese instruments with lots of pipes. And the thing is, like, you may have a brain shaped in the right way. I mean, people's brains are shaped differently. Like physically, you can do it, looking at an MRI, like the actual shape of a person's brain is different. And that will have implications to what is the resonant modes of that brain. So my guess here is that the shape of your brain is such that if you change its functional architecture with salvia, you're creating a musical instrument that, for sheer luck, has a lot of consonants. But it's rare that like in most circumstances, if you mess with a finely tuned instrument, you're going to produce something that most combinations of notes are really unpleasant. Maybe you just happen to be lucky that
Well,
your instrument modified by salvia is positive. Yeah.
it's so funny that you're putting it into this analogy of musical instrument, because it was actually from my salvia experiences that I first started doing throat and overtone singing just spontaneously on salvia. And so it felt like just complete resonance, where there was this complete synchronization between the slow waves of energy and what I was feeling in my body and then how it was being expressed. And at first when it came out, it was very dissonant. Like I just felt this overwhelming urge to make sound, and it was kind of like, it sounded really gross. But then it just suddenly clicked into, and it's just, I started throat singing. It was from salvia, and it just felt absolutely harmonious. And so that's one of the reasons that for me, it just felt like, it's like, this is just great. I mean, take salvia and learn how to throat sing. How awesome is that,
I'll have to give it a try.
So since we're talking about salvia, and maybe you have an explanation for this, but it's also one of these really curious ones where I find it's very common when people, particularly when they have a very strong salvia experience, they immediately forget that they took something.
Oh, yeah.
And so then there's this major freak out, because it's just like, all of a sudden these multiple planes of reality are intermeshing and crossing, and people are like, what the fuck is going on? And there's not the cognition of, oh yeah, I just smoked salvia. That's what's going on. It's just, no, reality is being impinged by this really bizarre event that's taking place, and they don't remember. And then afterwards they're like, oh yeah, that's why I smoked salvia. And I haven't seen, and maybe because it's such an abrupt oncoming, it's just like, it kind of just turns on. But I wonder if you have anything to say about why that may be with salvia. And I haven't seen that with other quote unquote substances.
Boring answer, but it would be, okay, if the classroom is responsible for interlocking your sense of self and your sense of environment, you disrupt that, and your sense of where you are and what you're doing gets thrown out the window. So I think it's like a kind of like radical decontextualization that happens.
Okay, good. All right. So I know that you're going to have to go in not too long. So I do want to talk about 5-MeO.
Yeah.
And I think we've established sort of the baseline of the vocabulary and the concepts that we're dealing with here. And so now I would just invite you to go ahead and just lay it on us.
Oh my gosh.
How you apply this to the 5-MeO experience.
Yeah, totally. So I guess one word I didn't define is valence.
Okay.
So, but I'll connect it with 5-MeO to keep it short. So essentially, valence is how good or bad an experience feels. I get a lot of pushback from a lot of people in an unfair way, actually, because, so here's the thing. If you say like, I'm all about like maximizing, pleasure, reducing pain, people will say, oh, you're like a shallow person. Like, no. The point of life is not pleasure. It's meaning or something like that. They will say. But no, actually, if you introspect on what the hell meaning is, it's actually a pleasant configuration of mind. Like very meaningful experiences are essentially like interlocking with inner archetypes that have a blissful, resonant, reverb quality to them. And when you feel that you have a lot of meaning, you're embodying those beautiful archetypes. And my strong guess is if you were to look at it, from a neuroscientific point of view, embodying an archetype, it's actually inhabiting a very resonant, consonant, configuration of your brain, which is, in our worldview, high valence. So essentially, meaning it's actually still under the umbrella of valence. And you could very easily test this by like having a supposedly hyper meaningful moment, but then taking an opioid antagonist, and you will realize that, it's not the meaning that you were after. It was actually the pleasant quality of it that was the thing that you actually cared for. So, and also the other thing is like a lot of people may think of, pleasure and pain as kind of like a selfish framework and so on. My read of it is that it's actually the universe's utility function, that there is like valence, like feeling of well-being and not suffering is fundamentally what the universe wants. And like, okay, we're just kind of like a tiny shard of that, but like at the most fundamental level, like there is a value axis in the universe, and valence is disclosing it. Except that we are shaped in this weird way by natural selection that the ways by which we feel good are more or less the things that maximize our inclusive fitness and our probability of reproduction. So we are kind of like open layers of delusion about like what is it that we actually want. And I mean, starting from like believing in our sense of self and things like that, so many things like that. So I generally would characterize the reason why 5-MeO DMT is so profound is for two reasons. Well, three core reasons to keep it short. So number one, it eliminates internal boundaries. Like that's a very, very essential thing. So essentially, if you look at how waves behave in physics, you can roughly divide wave behavior into two categories. There is linear waves and there are non-linear waves. Most of the way in which people think about waves is in linear, which is like where this principle of superposition applies, where like, okay, if two waves are moving and they're going to collide, they kind of like just pass through each other. Mm-hmm. And like that's how sound works. That's how like most, water waves typically work. But there's non-linear waves as well. And like maybe you may have seen, for example, in a beach environment, sometimes you get these weird waves where like, okay, two huge waves collide and then they actually kind of bounce off of each other. They don't go through each other. So that's a non-linear effect. And in my model of the brain, essentially, this is a lot, but I'll just lay it out. Essentially, I think the brain is a non-linear optical system. And essentially the constructs, the things that we experience, the reifications, the sense of self, anytime you particularize something, is essentially a non-linearity. You're essentially creating kind of one of these waves that do bounce off of each other. In Eastern traditions, they would associate it with you're creating kind of a samskara or like a karma impression, like that gets left over in your nervous system. So, and your personality, your sense of self, all of that is essentially this kind of like big bucket of non-linearities that you have constructed over your life. You take 5-MeO DMT, and it linearizes the behavior of the waves. So essentially, waves all of a sudden, they go through each other. And so your sense of self, all the things that you have constructed kind of like become ethereal because the energy goes through them. And this process of the energy going through them actually de-energizes them and sort of defabricates them, dissolves them. And as a consequence, on kind of like a decent dose of 5-MeO, like, I don't know, you probably are much more acquainted with significant doses, but let's say like something that is like, okay, clearly psychoactive, something like, 5 milligrams, let's say. Essentially something that happens is that you will gain access to your natural nervous system harmonics, and you will, in a sense, be finding all the ways in which they're imperfect and smoothing out those imperfections. So, for example, left and right, if they're not perfectly symmetrical, the kind of like power wash of the energy of 5-MeO DMT will be kind of like symmetrifying it until they actually harmonize. Or like up and down is like, okay, there's some kind of imperfection and like and until it actually gets symmetrical and smooth. And that will happen along all of the dimensions along which our nervous system resonates, which effectively might work as kind of like a factory reset because you're kind of getting in touch with your natural harmonics as opposed to the convoluted Rube Goldberg machine harmonics that take place when you're like full of these nonlinearities.
Right. So the way that I have described it is that if you allow it, because people can resist, but if you allow it, that what it does is it creates an energetic reconditioning of the sense of self that is embodied. And that's when we see like people they vibrate, just as you're saying, that there's vibrating, there's a lot of convulsing and shaking that's going on. And then that eventually, as long as people ride that out and let all the convulsing and the shaking and the vibrating take place, that then it suddenly smooths out. And then we see this perfect symmetry that shows up in people's bodies with these spontaneous movements where everything is flowing very fluidly and it's very harmonious. And then as the ego comes back in, then we start to see these asymmetries take place and then people start vibrating again.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of getting out of sync with that natural harmonic resonance that you're describing.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, 100%. I guess the other thing 5-MeO does is it's also a powerful energizer. It might be the strongest energizer. I mean, it's probably the highest level of energy that you can get to probably is with 5-MeO,
Yeah.
not DMT. Although I'm definitely pretty scared of like high dose 5-MeO DMT because yeah, I mean it's a wild card. But let's put an asterisk there as well. I want to revisit that in a second. But like for me, also 5-MeO DMT is probably the most important molecule for researching consciousness and researching valence because it shows precisely that like the highest level of well-being actually comes when you have perfectly smooth space and high energy. So like the combination of highly energized, smooth consciousness, which in our theory, that's high valence because it's highly symmetrical, what we call the symmetry theory of valence. And essentially imperfections and nonlinearities and like shears and pinch points, any of that is a source of discomfort and unpleasant qualities. And yeah, I mean, the ego is constructed out of those. I mean, like, it's one of the things that, a Buddhist who meditates a lot will tell you, like, relative to nirvana, everything hurts. It's like, yeah, I mean, when you're coming down from, from a peak, beautiful 5-MeO DMT experiences, you realize, like, oh my gosh, my ego is actually a source of pain. But it's like, it's a discomfort you don't associate with discomfort because you're so embedded in it. And yeah, also, connecting it with what you're saying of like shaking and this essentially the natural harmonics shaking off kind of your ego and your nonlinearities. I will say that for me, it was very insightful to realize, partly thanks to like trying to understand 5-MeO DMT, that there's really like three kinds of waves of energy in the nervous system. And if you have only ever taken mushrooms, or like if you've ever done like classical psychedelics, including DMT, you will only actually be acquainted with one out of the like three fundamental waves of energy. And the one that you will be acquainted with is essentially what we call like semantically neutral energy, which is essentially this like energization. DMT, I would catalog it as like kind of the archetypical like energizer of that kind, where like, yes, just energizing your nervous system, the waves will be bouncing off of each other. And so, yeah, actually the symmetrical structures that you were describing, if you pay attention to them, you will notice that the way they're constructing is like there's waves of energy that are bouncing off of each other. And every symmetrical structure is constructed recursively out of waves that are bouncing off of each other. And their local energy minima will be the symmetrical configurations. But all of that is like, wave number one, which is semantically neutral energy. Then there's a different kind of energy, which I call dark night of the soul type energy, which is essentially this quality of defabrication or deconstruction, which in terms of kind of like things that maybe people may be acquainted with, is very similar to restless legs or akinesthesia or like opioid withdrawal. All of those have that quality of kind of like restlessness and like, there's energy that wants to get out, but it doesn't form good patterns. And in meditation practice, like that's a stage. I mean, if you want to get enlightened, you will go through like long periods of like that and like dealing with that. And it's very unpleasant. But I understand that that's kind of a natural effect of the shaking off of the inbuilt, sense of self and pattern structures that you have accumulated. And a lot of people are much more clean than others. I mean, like if you've been taking a lot of methamphetamine and like are egomaniacal and something like that, you will probably have like a much deeper dark night of the soul than somebody who's like, very humble and doesn't, create a lot of self structures and things like that.
Yeah.
And then the third kind of wave of energy is equanimity. And that is the most beautiful and fascinating because it feels like it's actually waves of space-time. Like it's not even like a wave of energy that is traveling in your phenomenal field. It's more kind of like like when two black holes collide and they create these like gravitational waves, and it's actually like space-time stretching, or you get kind of this wave of extra space and time. Yeah, on 5-MeO that also happens. You get kind of this, wow, there's like this expansion of space-time, and that has this quality of acceptance and allowing and permitting and embracing absolutely whatever happens. And to me, it's actually one of the most promising ways of getting rid of suffering, because you could be in pain. If you have enough equanimity, if you have like a high enough dose of those waves, it's not going to be a problem. So I think it's even better than painkillers, although painkillers, we should also work on them. But yeah.
Yeah, because it can actually dissolve the pain in that moment. And then if you have created a higher level of resonance and coherency within yourself through the experience, then you actually encounter the pain afterwards in a different way. And as you're saying, that the ego itself can cause discomfort. And it reminds me of how many people report that even paradoxically, they're in their highly energized state in 5-MeO, but they say, coming back, they say, I felt more relaxed than I ever have in my life, and realized that every time I thought I was relaxed before, I actually wasn't. And now I've experienced what true relaxation is. Yeah. And so it brings down the level of internal tension, so that as we then do encounter discomfort and do encounter pain, which of course we will as human beings, because that's part of life, that we're actually able to encounter it in a way that has more equanimity, and we are less likely to be disrupted, and then can live with it in a way that is more livable, I think.
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, essentially the level of kind of inner tension that you will have in everyday life will be the result of a homeostasis process. Is essentially the homeostasis between the rate of fabrication of inner tension and the rate of dissipation of inner tension. So essentially, yeah, I mean, if you meditate every day on like a do nothing meditation or things like that, you will be like spending 1 hour defabricating, essentially letting these like structures shake themselves apart. But if you're like, for example, really angry at somebody or something, or like, yeah, you're like really angry with the system, actually, whatever it may be, but like if you have that, it will be increasing the rate of fabrication of inner tension. So it's very unfortunate. I mean, I think like a lot of kind of like quarrels that happen between people and conflicts, polarization, you name it, is literally just kind of like an engine of inner tension that got started. And like every attempt to deal with it is maybe locally relieving that tension, maybe insulting the person or whatever it may be. But actually globally, you're adding more stress to the system. And so it's a feedback loop. It's very difficult to get out of it, because every one of your options just adds more stress. And that's also why I think like 5-MeO has such huge potential for even like relationship therapy, because it gives you this like button of like, oh yeah, do this thing. Or like for 20 minutes, you will not be adding stress. You will actually be realizing how adding stress is the road to hell, like how you're creating hell for yourself by doubling down on the stress. Yeah, but I guess like go ahead.
I was just going to say, to kind of tie it back to something that came up a bit earlier in the conversation, is that the sense of satisfaction and happiness and pleasure that we get out of meaning, and that this is another thing that can actually then become an addiction of the ego, is the production of meaning and the attachment to meaning, because it is satisfying. Yeah. And this is what I love about 5-MeO, is that it has the potential to disrupt all sense of meaning into the ultimate meaning of this experience of oneness, where it's not this particular view, or it's not that particular ideology, or whatever it may be, so that, that we do get these attachments to meaning, because it does satisfy something that is pleasurable, even if that meaning is then fed into a narrative that is creating dissonance and disharmony, and my meaning is better than your meaning, and so we've got to fight each other over it, whether it's a relationship or whether it's cultures or society. And so we get the opportunity to disrupt all of that and then generate a new, more holistic meaning from the event. So it's a meaning resetter in a sense.
Yes. Absolutely. Two things here. One, 100%, I would say 99% of people are addicted to meaning, and they don't recognize it as an addiction, which is like worse. Like one classic example to me is Santa Teresa, which a lot of people consider a saint, but like she had like these like clinics for the dying, right? And they had the option of giving them morphine to die without like horrible pain.
Yeah.
But she was saying like, no, embrace the pain. And like kissing the pain is like kissing Jesus or something like that. okay, like she is addicted to this like Jesus meaning thing.
Yes.
And then she's projecting it onto others and thinking like that's the solution to their problems. But so she's worse than a heroin addict by saying that sort of thing. And we have that is obviously a huge problem in our society. Meaning addiction is definitely not better than like drug addiction in any way. Although they're synergistic, obviously. But
yeah, especially because it's not thought of that way by most
exactly.
people. That
Yeah.
it's thought of as enriching, or that, well, my belief system that this gives my life meaning and therefore it has value, but it actually might be destructive and harmful to others because you're imposing it upon them. And
Yeah.
that whole idea of redemption through suffering, like the more you suffer, that somehow then the better you are,
Yeah.
and that this is, I see it as a huge issue within psychedelic culture itself, about the imposition of meaning onto events and onto the stories and onto the experiences, and my way or my lineage versus your way or whatever. So it's just as endemic in psychedelic culture as it is elsewhere. And this is why I just find it so refreshing to speak with you, because I've tried to develop my own sort of neutral language to talk about psychedelic experience, but you're coming from this cognitive science, philosophy of mind background, and it's also, I feel it's very neutral, that it's not the imposition of meaning. What we're trying to do is just describe as best we can what's going on and understand it from that basis of description, and then also see what are the possible benefits of that. So I think it's a wonderful approach that here in our conversation, you haven't once tried to tell me about the afterlife or about spirits or about deities or anything like that. And this is like fantastic. It's great.
Completely. I do remember like maybe in an interview or an article or something, you said like people's obsession with DMT is kind of an ego thing, because like, oh, I'm special because the aliens are talking to me, and like I won the cosmic lottery, and like it's fabrication. It's like ego fabrication, 100%. Super fascinating, very important for scientific research and like figuring out how consciousness works. But yeah, let's not wrap it up as a blanket and feel like we're special. Like it's just not gonna help. It's not gonna make you be happier, essentially. I'll briefly like explain like along the lines of the presentation I'm going to be giving in 25 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, the aesthetics. I mean, aesthetics are like, I would think of it as like the what's underlying meaning structures. And just briefly, like essentially, they have like three components. So first of all, they have like eros, which is the set of imagery that elicits kind of a thirst for life, or like this desire to embody them or make them larger, like inhabit them, vivify them. And people have like very different eros imagery. Like what like is the thing that gets you excited or like makes you feel like a good person? Is it like giving to the poor, or is it joining the military? Okay, like very different aesthetics in that level.
Yes.
Then there's the psyche, which is the way in which the eros imagery is connected to each other in order to form narratives and kind of like a web of meaning of these kind of sources of thirst for life. And then the deeper layer is the logos, which is your overarching conception of reality as a whole. And they kind of like stand as a pyramid. And like the problem that happens in society, in relationships, is that people who have like different eros imagery, when they talk to each other, they have dissonant experiences because the eros, they don't match. The problem, though, is that they get too focused on the stress that happens with this mismatch, and they kind of like attack each other, as opposed to diagnosing it as like, hold on a second, this like rests on like layers of psyche and ultimately on these different conceptions of reality. And like if we actually wanted to resolve the disagreement, we would have to go to the level of logos and like actually talk philosophy. We're not gonna, moralizing or so on is not gonna help. And I think like, that's another reason why something like 5-MeO-DMT I find, so impressive, is because it defabricates everything. It gives you access to kind of like the cleanest logos you could imagine. It's kind of like pure, unadulterated consciousness, where like, for me, if that is your conception of the base of reality, agreements are going to be possible, because like there's something grounded we stand on that is universal as opposed to socially constructed.
Right. That we get into, to use the philosophical language, we're getting into the most mundane or the most absolute state of consciousness, just consciousness without content, consciousness without identity. And then where we tend to argue socially is, up here at the top of the pyramid of my set of surface ideas are more important than your set of surface ideas, and my set of surface identification is more important than yours. So let's go kill each other. Let's fight it out, and let's see who's right. And that's why I see 5-MeO is so important, because it allows us access to that basement level of consciousness that everything else is built upon. And then we can say, well, let's start from there. Let's start the conversation from there, and then we can see how these are just the surface manifestations. But so much of society and politics, and like I used to self-identify as a political activist. That's all happening at the surface level, at this eros identification level, and that's when, for me, once I experienced 5-MeO DMT, it's like, oh, I can see I'm not a social activist anymore. I'm not a political activist anymore.
Nice.
Because I see that this actually is getting to the root. And so that's why then I've devoted the rest of my time to trying to share not only about 5-MeO, but how to actually help people get into that, and then have this energetic reconditioning that we're talking about, and have this, this resonance between the aspects of the self and all of that. So I know I've got to let you go because you've got another thing coming up, but I'd just like to bring us back to where we started. So where are you now on the position of oneness?
Oh my gosh. Well, so I do think this brings up probably my theory of ethics, which is so a lot of people think of ethics as like let me just like go through like the 4 layers, I think, or like the 4 stages I went through, for sure. I'm sure people as well. Essentially, first you start with kind of the battle between good and evil, because obviously the way our nervous system is built, we have the feeling of like, oh, there are evil things, and like it's good to fight them. Okay, like that's not very helpful. It generates a lot of stress and doesn't clarify things. The second layer, where I think a lot of people in the psychedelic community are stuck, actually, is the balance between good and evil. People will say like, well, everything is perfect already. Like there's nothing we have to do. Like this is just a cycle, whatever.
Yeah.
But then if you look at, okay, why do they believe that? Actually, that belief is causing them to feel good. So ironically, they're actually kind of using it to feel better. And therefore, obviously, they're not embracing their belief at actual face value. They're actually using it as an antidepressant. So there's kind of a mismatch between the content and like why they're using it. Then you get to the third one I might describe as gradients of wisdom, which is a lot of, let's say, like Sam Harris, and like there's a number of thinkers, I would say, like they're kind of there, which is like, hey, like it is not the case that like every mode of social organization is equally valid. It's not the case that all philosophies are equally valid. Like, that postmodern approach, like that's nonsense.
Yeah.
There are better and worse states of being. Suffering is real. Let's be pragmatic about it, like, etc. And then like the one that I advocate, which would be kind of the fourth layer, would be consciousness versus replicators. And it sounds dualistic and it sounds kind of like a battle, but it's just a way of describing it. Like truly, it's kind of like the battle between clarity and confusion at a very, very deep level, which is like, okay, like we're all consciousness. And like, in a sense, like if we want to have a good time, we've got to reduce suffering across like any and all sentient beings. And the risk that we have is to identify with a particular pattern and then forget that we are consciousness. And I mean, that's absolutely a possible attractor. I mean, I envision there are paths towards the future where, like, I think maybe the first chapter of your book, you mentioned like China banned 5-MeO DMT or something like that. I mean, essentially, yeah, like if like the powers that be, find like, oh gosh, there's this consciousness movement going on and will disrupt it, they might just make illegal like a certain information or access of clarity because it disrupts that particular replicator, that particular structure that is self-reinforcing. So I do kind of think is like, okay, we're in a critical period in history where maybe consciousness will win. And then the question is, okay, what would it mean for consciousness to win? Is for clarity to win, is for us to be mindful about like what kind of patterns do we want to see in the universe and try to essentially replicate enlightenment and clarity and make the world kind of a playground for consciousness, as opposed to, this like, tangled up mess of like replicators that are just defensive and trying to continue independent of their inherent value.
Okay. I think that's a good place to wrap it up, to be replicators of clarity.
Yes.
Yes. And we can maybe even add in a little harmony and some pleasure and well-being as well.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe I'll mention one last thing, which is I recommend checking out this article. I think it's The Supreme State of Unconsciousness on Qualia Computing, basically interviewing somebody who, fascinating guy, 26 years old, who achieved a fourth path, which is like a very advanced like Buddhist enlightenment level. What's fascinating about him is that he has tried a bunch of other things as well, like LSD, MDMA, candy flip. You name it. He's done it. All the jhanas, these blissful meditation states. He also has tried 5-MeO-DMT, and he says that his current state, like now, like everyday life, like moment to moment, is essentially like even more blissful and more clear than 5-MeO-DMT, but still perfectly functional. I mean, essentially, he describes his consciousness as perfectly holographic with no sense of self. And yet he's like able to talk. You can interview him. It would be great for you to talk to him, I think. But it's just a proof of concept that you could actually, change the nervous system forever to just permanently be in that state. He just says like he feels way better than how he would feel on MDMA, like just overall super high well-being. So that's kind of part of my mission, is like, how do we accelerate getting there, essentially.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Andres. And it's just been a really fascinating conversation. I'm so glad that this random person sent me this screenshot of this conversation online that happened over a year ago, so that we ended up here today. It's been just a pleasure and a delight to have you on, and hope we can stay in touch and continue to share thoughts and ideas. But it's really been excellent.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. All right. Take care, Martin. Okay. Thank you so much.